Okay, so remember, chapter 2 of your thesis is your literature review. You can find out information about it in chapter 5 in your textbook, okay? Talks about the lit review in the textbook in chapter 5. And you'll see a picture similar to this, although I think it might be blue now or something. Remember, in my opinion, this is the most difficult chapter, but as you go through, I'll be interested to see what you guys think. Just because it's difficult for me when I learned to do a lit review, the conceptual, like, what am I supposed to put? Like, it was just annoying. So I'm hoping it's not as annoying for you guys and you really end up loving it. So one thing to remember is that you often learn about literature reviews from looking at a couple of those links to websites where they give you a few little generalities about them. But even between websites, you'll see differences. You really learn about it from looking at other lit reviews and getting ideas. But remember, a literature review is yours, your personal document. If you and I were to take the exact same 10 articles and each go in our little holes and read them and write an AB and write a literature review, they would be different. Okay, so a literature review is really focused on what you're trying to tell a story about to your audience. Remember, it's your topic and your audience is this K-12 world of leadership, right? Your goal is to summarize the findings of each study and created an annotated bibliography and then synthesize it into a lit review. The lit review itself should start very broad. So for example, if we were, Jessica, what's your topic again?
It is students, oh my goodness, having a brain fart. It's just students that, their resistance of students in general ed classrooms.
Resistance, what do you mean by that?
Like just general ed teachers that's not wanting students with disabilities in their classrooms.
Okay, got it. So resistance for special ed kind of thing. So
yes.
So perfect, love it. Okay, so Jessica, if we look at the top, so we're going to use yours as a kind of an example, and I'm going to make up stuff from here, but just so I have something. Feel free to use it if it's any good. At the top of this funnel, remember this is like a funnel, but it's sideways right now. At the top of the funnel, Jessica might choose to pull in some information like about special ed kids and the achievement gap in special ed. This big funnel at the top, or achievement gap in general, and then specific to special ed, broad achievement gap stuff. Then get a little more specific on something maybe related to inclusion, right? Because inclusion practices and stuff into the general ed classroom, setting up that story, the ins and outs of all of that. Because why would a special ed kid be in there? Other than, in my opinion, they should all be in there. But anyway, you know, what is the research around inclusion and all of that? And then you would probably get into, from that inclusion literature, problems associated with that, which might be teacher perceptions and teacher strategies and all that kind of stuff. See how we're getting more and more down to these very specific, more similar literature on these strategies. You see? So she's kind of making a case for, therefore, I'm going to research, right, these teacher perceptions or whatever she's going to do. Do you see in that example how it would go? Do you want me to do one more? Dana, give me your topic again, and I'll do one more.
My topic is on using student reflection to look at alternative assessments in writing. Can you hear me?
Yes. Okay. I was thinking there. Okay. So you might start, super easy to start yours, broad achievement gap, English language arts, right?
Right.
Then you're going to go into something more specific on how we look at, you know, what type of assessments we use in English language arts, that kind of stuff, or something, or assessments in general in language arts, and maybe teachers' strategies or perceptions around that, or something. I don't know what's out there in that little area.
Mhm.
And then finally, you would get into the thing about using students for their own formative assessments or their own, how could we use students in their own assessments and that kind of thing. And that'd probably be at the bottom of your funnel. And then hence you're going to study X.
Mhm.
Do you see how that's the story you're trying to sell in this literature review?
Yes.
Okay. Is that what you were thinking maybe from what you've been finding?
Well, I think I started a little bit more like narrow and not as broad with some of the studies that I was looking at. Like I went directly into like writing assessments and
Yeah, that's great because
Yeah.
you need more of that
right.
if you can. Because
Yeah.
the broad topic at the top could be a
Mhm.
paragraph, it could be a page, it could be
Yeah.
whatever you want it to be. So
Mhm.
the amount. So one of the things, and we're going to move into this next, you bring up a very good point, is this next piece. Remember the chapter 2 rubric. Remember to write it in present tense, and we're trying to all be advanced across this rubric. You guys are probably like, oh, another rubric like CalAPA, but it's okay. This one at least has words in it that make sense. So present tense, and you really have to be proficient or advanced. You can be either of these, but you want to push for advanced, okay? You can't be novice or you won't pass your chapter 2 or any chapters that we have a rubric for the whole thing. So let's look across the top here. Remember, you're going to want to make sure you're in advanced range if possible. This rubric moves from left to right. So let's take a look. As we go look at, before I do that, let me go back up here. These top sections all the way across this first row will appear on every single chapter rubric, okay? And it will appear there because it's the APA stuff. It's the grammar stuff. It's expected to be well written, each of the chapters. Okay, I'm going to stop there. Taryn, go ahead.
I just want to know, so is the AB, does that have to be written in present tense then also?
AB is totally for you. Totally for you. There's no language, nothing in it. However you write it. I had all kinds of like passive voice and mixed up verbs, and just so I got the stuff on the page.
Right. Thank you.
I mean, sometimes a professor will really want it tight and perfect and all that. In our timeline and time frame, so if you do a doctorate, they'll be much more strict about your AB. But in this case, we're using it as a tool to get to this lit review, which is a little tighter. Okay. Okay, so be careful up here because for proficient, you want most of it to be clear, concise, well organized, good sentence structure, no more than 5 spelling errors and grammar, syntax kinds of things. Like, so be careful with that. But honestly, and nowadays with word correction stuff, we don't end up with too much of that. But APA, there has to be no errors to get an advance. Don't worry, I'll point them out for you. I'm very obsessive about it, so I'll point them out. Now, you can fix them, okay? So now let's move into this next part, the introduction to chapter 2. It's very important that you start your chapter 2 by saying, chapter 2 literature review. Okay, that's your title. And that should be what? A level 1 heading. So it's centered and bold and all title, all capitals. Just like this, chapter 2 literature review. Obviously you don't put rubric, but you can look at this rubric and use the titles off each chapter to really dictate your masters for you. So you don't have to, really think, just write that. Now, as we go here, you're going to see, you're going to have an introduction. Now notice right here, the introduction, it tells you, do not use this heading. Don't put that heading in. They're just telling you now write a little introduction, okay? Identify the problem and restate the research question. Then you move, then it says, and, see the and here? And do this, preview the contents of the rest of the whole chapter, explain the purpose of the review, and explain the methodology you're going to use for your study. Now, your first question right now should be, I don't know what my methodology is going to be. I don't know what's going to be in the chapter because I haven't written it yet, right? So your thought right now should be, I am not writing the introduction until I'm done with the rest. or maybe that as you start to write it, that'll kind of become your introduction. You might pull a little something, something out, but don't feel like you got to start here. Okay, just know that you're going to have to come back up and make sure you've got this part of the rubric at the top of your literature review with no boldface level 2 heading that says introduction. So this rubric is super important to you, and most master's students will print it and kind of highlight it when they think they've got it done, you know, and double checking their work. And use all the titles of the literature review in the subsections in the introduction as signposts. So I'm going to show you an example of that in a minute. In other words, if I talk about in my little overview of the chapter and I say, I'm going to cover English language learners and this and this and this, then those are probably my little level 2 bold-faced titles as the person reads through. Do you see? Does that make sense? I'm going to say that one more time. Right here, when it says all to get to advance, all they're asking you to do is make sure that in your little overview of the chapter, right? Preview the contents of the chapter. You're going to mention these little things there, right? In that paragraph introduction. And I would hope as the reader that as I read, I'm going to see those things as level 2 headers going down the document. Any questions on that? No. Okay. But again, remember, hold off on this whole introduction until you do the rest. Okay, so now let's go to this overview of the context of the literature. I put a yellow star here on purpose. It says optional section. In other words, it's not optional like you don't have to do it. It's optional as in you can have it be separate, or you can combine it with this introductory paragraph. I strongly, strongly, strongly recommend it just as part of your introductory paragraph. Otherwise, it's too difficult to figure out what the difference is. Okay. It says contextualize the study in the field of educational literature by identifying the key areas of literature. Well, guess what? Key areas of literature is going to be those signpost things. Okay, like in Jessica's case, it's going to be things about teacher perception of inclusion, you know, those things. So why wouldn't you just kind of say that as part of up here and not call it out specifically and almost be repeating yourself? I think it works better. It's a nicer introduction when you put all this together. It turns out 1,000 times better. And explain how the area connects to this research study. How do these things connect to what you're actually going to study? And you say something about the reasons you're reviewing the literature and the criteria and analyzing and comparing it and the organization. In other words, you say something about you focused on inclusion practices, but not for full inclusion, but you did not discuss hybrid models of inclusion. Like you might say something like that. Or you might say, I focused on inclusion, teacher perception, which you're already going to be saying as these signposts. So why say it again, right? And yet you could just expand those sentences to be, but I didn't go into anything about some other special ed topic, right? Like that somebody might think of. You're kind of explaining what's in there, but what is not. Okay. So again, I'm going to recommend these 6 squares all get wrapped up together as an introduction. Now we're going to go down to the actual core content of your lit review. It's 12 to 15 pages. It's synthesized and is basically, you're going to have these topics as headers, level 2 headers as I read as a reader. Okay, and you're going to organize your key themes that lay the foundation for your research. When I say that, I mean the funnel. You're going to organize it to where it follows the funnel. That's all that means. You're going to use layman terms to introduce the sentences in the beginning of paragraphs, signposts. Again, you're going to have these boldface headings. Then I know that I'm reading all about this. You're going to point out overall trends, and you're going to summarize individual studies or articles as much or as little as they merit. In other words, you might throw something in there and from one person and throw another something in from the other, but it all summarizes into one thing. But you might want to talk about inclusion, Jessica, in a page or two. Or maybe depending on your topic, that if you were talking, maybe you want to throw something in there on other types of inclusion models, but those might be just a little paragraph because you're just throwing it in there. It's not important because you're really focusing on this gen ed piece. But you want the reader to understand there's other things, so they might be smaller. That's where the space, how much space you give something in this lit review is important. Because I might read that as, oh, I learned about this type of special ed and gen ed thing, and I learned about this type. Oh, and then I have full inclusion that's like 2 pages. But I just had a little paragraph on the others because that's not really what this is about, but at least she's educating me as someone that knows nothing, which isn't true, but I'm just saying. Okay. Build research citations on each other. Do not create a list of annotated bibliography paragraphs. You will not do well. You have to summarize them together. Now, it's fine if a whole paragraph has to be about one author because there's no other authors you found and they're continuing your story. That's fine. I'm just saying, don't do one thing about teacher perception of inclusion from one author, then the next paragraph is a whole nother author. You need to be summarizing those things. If these two authors say the same thing about inclusion in some way, then you write together and you put both of them at the end of the paragraph. That makes sense? So they might be saying things about inclusion that are similar. So you put that all, you're summarizing what they've said that's all similar, and then you put both authors at the end. That's a synthesis of work, as opposed to a boxcar, one author, then the next, then the next. That doesn't mean, because you guys are limited, you're not doing like 5 million authors. So you're going to have some paragraphs that have an author about them. Don't stress. Use proper APA formatting. You can go back 10 years if you'd like, but you have to have at least 60 to 70% peer reviewed. This is where we start to open you up a little bit more if you want to have some other stuff in some areas. So Jessica, you may have a bunch of stuff in special ed that comes from some leadership magazines, some other, you know what I'm saying? Like, so that means 4 out of your 10 could be non-peer reviewed if you want to pull for some other stuff now. Okay. And illustrate multiple authors' views. We just said that, including conflicts in their theory or methodology, evidence, conclusion. All this one means is, does one author say one thing and full inclusion is great? This author says it's terrible. So you would bring that up. Okay, some juxtaposition of maybe authors' ideas that you found, if you find them, or if they're all the same, then you don't got to worry about it. Identify the strengths and weaknesses of the research if you can find any, and obviously use appropriate. Now, this is where we push you. If you want advanced, then now you're using 80% peer reviewed. So that means only 2 out of 10 can be from non-peer reviewed. Okay, so you decide where you want to be on this particular part. Honestly, I think you should push yourself up here with advanced with 80% because you really don't need, you need peer reviewed journal articles to make your words. So I don't see how you can. Anyway, notice the lit review areas, your boldface headings. I can't dictate to you what they're going to be because it depends on your topic, right? Those would be those different things that you want me to read about as I'm going down. But you will have this boldface heading. Conclusion will be your final level 2 heading that you will put into your lit review. Once you're there, you're going to summarize the key concepts, the major contributions, and articulate how the literature areas combine to make a strong foundation for your research study. And you're going to say your research question again. I will warn you right now, every single chapter of your thesis must have your research question in the intro and your research question in the conclusion. And make sure you call it out. So you'll see that in a lot of the example theses. Go look how they do it. It's called out. Okay. Conclude by providing some insights to the relationship of the literature and your area of study. How does it relate? And make this nice and fresh. You can't have the exact same conclusion in every single chapter, and you're going to find that you start to get annoyed because you're summarizing and summarizing the same stuff over and over again. And so you get annoyed by the time you write these introduction and conclusions over and over and over again, but it's got to be fresh. It can't be copy paste from another chapter. Okay, this is where that little helpful phrases and things that Dr. Souls gives out, I've got it in our course also. It's really helpful, some of those furthermore, and just things to make things fresh and move and connect. Okay. So this is the chapter 2 rubric that you want to now be, as you get your annotated bibliography done, if you're using a synthesis matrix, great. Then you can start to see how you're going to put this together, and you just start writing. You're going to write these main literature review areas, okay, this main where the big green star is, then go back and do your intro and then your conclusion. If you do that, you'll be a lot less frustrated. Now remember, when we say 12 to 15 pages, that's double spaced. Push yourself to 15 pages. You will like the fact that you won't have more writing to do later. Okay, get yourself to 15 pages, not including the cover page. And not including your references. Okay, because then you won't have to do a bunch of adding and more journals and this and that when you're trying to do your methodology in your chapter 1. Okay, so now's the time to push. These next 3 weeks, we're in week 5, 6, 7. So these next 4 weeks, this is all you're doing. Your annotated bibliography and your lit review. Okay, that's it. Okay. Going to stop sharing that. Screen just went black. It's always scary when you see the screen turn all blue or all yellow or all green or something. When it goes all one color, I'm freaking out. Okay. Oh, there it is. I organized myself. So now what we're going to do is we're going to talk about methodology, and you'll see that there's a chapter in the course this week for you to read, not reading in your textbook, right? That's no longer on your syllabus yet. There's an actual chapter to read in the Cougar container. Make sure you read it. It's on qualitative coding, and it's a very good little, you're going to need it. It's long and you want to read it and make sure you kind of get it, because people really need that to make it through when you start to do your qualitative coding. So make sure you read it. You can read it quickly. You don't have to know it word for word, but you might want to just put like on each page some little notes on the side if you print it out, or annotate it, download it and annotate it electronically. Just give yourself some keynotes. Oh, this is the coding section. That's where they said this. So you could go back to it quickly. Okay, so now I'm going to talk a little bit about methodology so you can start to decide slowly. You won't be deciding really till we get to the next class, but you might have a real good hint as we talk right now, maybe. Okay, you can see it, right? Research methodology. Yep, okay. So there's 3 main research paradigms, and they all share values, assumptions, practices, and concepts around the area of research. Qualitative research, mixed methods research, which is qualitative and quantitative combined, and then quantitative research. And we're going to talk about each one tonight. Okay, so that you have enough of an idea in your brain cells to be like, okay, Myra told me some stuff. This is what I think. Because your next time you meet with me, I kind of want to shore up what your research is going to be about, what you're thinking. We make it a little tighter, and I can get you really focused on a methodology so that when you go into 622B, you're ready to write chapter 3. Okay, you'll be reading quant and qual chapters, and during the first 3 weeks of that class, you're going to decide on this. So I'm just previewing it so that you understand a little bit more about it. Okay, first of all, when we talk about quantitative research, this is an area where it really develops these very specific characteristics. So for example, A quantitative variable is something that's a variable that varies in degree or amount of phenomenon. For example, the variable annual income. It varies from 0 to very high, okay? A categorical variable, a variable that is made up of different types of categories and phenomenon. For example, the variable gender is made up of categories of what? Male, female, that's it. In quantitative research, we would identify gender as a characteristic that has 2 values or categories associated with it. We would identify male as we'd put a 0 in our little quantitative coding Excel spreadsheet, and we would say a female would get a 1. So we actually use numbers to identify specific things, and we call this our code book. We create a code book for different things. 0 is going to be male, 1s are going to be females, things like that. So what's interesting about this is then you can start to manipulate it and see what's connected to what. So an independent variable, and this is important because you're going to have to come up with an independent dependent variable in your study, but not really. I'll explain this later. If you have a quantitative study, if you have a mixed method study, it's very obvious what it is, but an independent variable is a variable that is presumed to cause changes to occur in another variable. It's the cause of something. The amount of studying independent variable affects test grades. So as the studying goes up, the grades go up. You see how the grades would therefore be what? The dependent variable, because the variable that changes because of another variable or effect or outcome variable is dependent. So this is how I always remember it, because everybody gets all confused. Wait, which one's which? Dependent is the variable that basically is dependent on something else happening. Otherwise, it's chilling. Okay, so the dependent variable is going to chill until something happens to make it change. And whatever happens to make it change is the independent variable. Okay, that's all you need to know. Mediating, moderating, or extraneous variables, you don't have to know. We might talk about them for your particular study as we're kind of looking at some things. Now, a lot of you are really not interested in quantitative research, but you might actually find that you end up doing a mixed methods if you're going to pull some data. But don't worry, because in the master's program, if you do some quantitative work, we put it in Qualtrics and it does all the work for you for the most part. It creates little charts and graphs for you. So it's actually, don't get scared away by this chaos. Okay, but you do need to know the difference between a dependent independent variable and that a quantitative variable, right, and a categorical variable. Notice the categorical has categories. The quantitative has, these range. Okay. So this is kind of a little overview of quant. The 2 most important pieces are this dependent independent variable. And now let's move on to qual. This is where most of you will lie, or mixed methods, you'll use both. With qualitative studies, the key ones are listed here. None of you are really doing action research because you're not doing a doing something and a post, at least not in the 3 weeks we have to carry out the work. Some of you might be doing this because you've met with me and we figured out how we're taking some stuff you already have and that kind of thing. So don't worry about that. The next time you meet with me, that's that second meeting we need to have as we develop your methodology. You'll feel better, but don't stress. Just like when you didn't stress before, you won't stress on your methodology. Okay, what is an ethnography? An ethnography is a portrait of people, study of the story and the culture of a group, usually to develop cultural awareness and sensitivity. Okay. So, for example, you could do an ethnography. Often you see this in a lot of the anthropological areas. They do ethnography a lot. We do ethnographies in educational research as well when you're trying to work with a specific group, maybe, okay? Then you have something called a phenomenological study. Now these are listed in your book. I don't know if you've seen them in there. It's in a table. And a phenomenological study is really a study of an individual's lived experiences of events. So for example, it doesn't mean they only study one individual. It means they're trying to find out the lived experience, in this example, basically how people living with AIDS experience AIDS care. Well, obviously, if that's the case, the phenomenon is those living with AIDS and their care experience. Nobody else is part of that group. It's a phenomenon focused on that group. So sometimes people do phenomenological studies of different specific groups or things happening in education as well. You might, for example, look at the Black and African American student experience in a doctoral program. Okay, you might do female leadership, something around that. It's the phenomenon of being part of a group or specific situation. Grounded theory, this is where nobody in a master's program is going to be doing grounded theory, but grounded theory is really about developing a new theory. So when we think of like the law of relativity, you know what I mean? Like we're going to come up with some grandiose new thing about educational paradigm. We're not doing that in a 6 months master's. We're not going to have enough work to do that. So grounded theory is out. You don't even have to consider it. Now, participatory action research, or also known as action research, that's where individuals and groups research their own personal beings. That's like you saying, okay, all my kids in English class, I'm going to give them this, then I'm going to teach a bunch of stuff, then I'm going to give them this. It's an action research. Then you're going to change it again and keep working until you get great outcomes. That's action research. It's that continuous improvement cycle we do as teachers all the time. We're doing action research all the time. We just don't write it all up every year or every project or every semester or every 2 weeks as we're trying to revamp our classes and our work. A case study by far is one of the most popular. A lot of master's students do a case study. It's an in-depth investigation of a single or small number of units of a point in time. For example, evaluation of a service. In your case, in Jessica's case, for example, her example would be an investigation into a single bounded system. If you read in the book about case studies, a single bounded system is going to be in the general education classroom teacher, like it's at one single school or in one single district. Okay, so it's a case study specific to that. We can't extrapolate it beyond there, but other people could read it and say, I wonder if that's true here, and do their own little study and see if there's any correlation or causation or things like that across their situation. Case studies are most popular, and most of you will end up doing a case study. The other thing that I didn't talk about yet of all these is if you look in your book, you'll see the chart of these different qualitative study designs, and it gives you exactly the type of data. Some of them don't allow you to do anything other than an interview. No other data allowed. Well, then you can't use that one. If you're planning on using some documents and some interviews and some survey, you see what I mean? Then you have to go with the case study. The case study is the one that lets you do the most, bring in the most. So make sure you take a look at that little chart when you start thinking about your methodology. Finally, the narrative is really popular, has gained more and more popularity in educational research because it's really telling the lived experiences. Some of these studies will interview 4 to 6 students and really tell the lived experience. For example, if you're studying things like our harsh discipline system in education and talking to 6 kids who have lived it, you can actually really get some interesting perspectives for leaders to think about in designing these punitive systems. Okay, so these types of things. The problem with the narrative technically is that a narrative is often very long and long term. Like you have to get a lot of information. Like it's very similar to ethnography. You got to get all kinds of stuff to be able to tell that story, but not always. So it depends on the study. So that gives you a little bit of background on the qualitative case study that you can also pick from. And that article, their chapter that I've given you in the Cougar course to read really will hone you in on some qualitative coding. In order to do one of these research studies, you're going to have to qualitatively code data, and it talks about that for you. We'll cover it in depth, and you guys will actually do some example coding coming up. And then you'll use your own and do some example coding and try it, and I'll check it. And then you can just run with your study after. Mixed method. Now this is where it gets fun. I love mixed methods because you have quantitative, which is experimental and non-experimental. That means things like where you're experimenting with data sets, or you could do things a lot of times in quantitative. Non-experimental would be things like survey data around male, female, how many teachers, like that's actually quantitative, anything with a number. You see, this is where people think, oh, I'm going to do all qualitative research. Well, technically, you're doing mixed method if you're getting a bunch of stuff before you do the qualitative. You see what I mean? But your mixed method could be very simple, where it's just what we call descriptive statistics. It's just, I had 27 teachers, 5 males, 3, that's descriptive statistics, and it doesn't require any statistics. It's just numbers and basic little table. So you might, but that's a mixed method study. Okay. It could also just stay qualitative with a descriptive statistics table. That's okay too. But if you decide to do mixed research, you're going to end up doing something on quantitative and something from qualitative. And your book has a really nice table how we call that out. We sit there and talk about what comes first, the chicken or the egg kind of thing. Well, first, we got all this data, then we looked at it, and then we did some follow-up interviews. So sometimes if you're studying grades, they might do a bunch of surveys of teachers first, and then some follow-up interviews. So the quantitative part was a Likert scale thing, and then they followed up with a couple of interviews. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and stop there. This is just a little preview tonight. We're going to dive deep when we get into the methodology, but I wanted to give you a little bit of information so that when you read that chapter, which ends up being a super useful chapter, everybody's like, I'm glad we had that chapter, because our book goes into detail on qualitative as well, but that chapter supplants that as well. So you'll be reading chapter 6 and 7 for qualitative as we move into 622B. Okay, but you don't have to worry about methodology right now, but you could be thinking about it, you know, just wondering as you think about it. We'll worry about it in the first 3 weeks of 622B, but I want to mention it because a lot of people you're reading these articles and you're like, what is that? Okay, to give you a little bit of heads up on those articles. If you happen to read their methodology and be like, what is that? Okay, I'm going to stop there. Are there any questions? Nope. Okay, I'm going to stick around. If anybody wants to chit chat or ask me questions, if you're needing any assistance or if anybody's overwhelmed, you're tired, exhausted, probably all of the above. Cal APAs, they're going great. Tonight I'm not grading, but I'm going in to give more feedback on step 2s if the stuff's in, if anything's in there. And step 1's my final review of those. I'm going kind of line by line now, double check tonight. So you guys should have all those back. If you're on my side of the team, you'll have those back tonight. You can look at your 1s and 2s if there's anything in your step 2. I don't remember when that one's due. I just keep looking in these folders and then keep moving forward. Taryn, were you able to get your step 1 shortened up?
Yes, yeah, it ended up being short and
Sweet and to the point. Make sure some of that could go to your step 2, you know, where you're analyzing.
yeah, it was very similar. I thought the step 2, there's a lot of things that I used,
Yeah,
like that.
Cut it and paste it over.
Mhm.
Okay. just so you notice that. But sometimes it helps to flush it out there and then copy and paste it over and then kind of flush it out over there. Because it's hard to just stick. So step one is really stick your data, show it, analyze it in 2, and then make a plan in 3. Carry, kind of a thing. Okay. Anybody worried, stressed, freaking out? No. That's good.